So let's go ahead and jump in. I wanted to provide an idea of what we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of personal history on myself and what my interests are in experiential therapy in the first place. Then we're actually going to talk about what experiential is. There is a view of experiential that is very rigid when it comes to the type of practice given the history. So we'll go over some of that piece. Then we're going to talk about how we apply the basic components of experiential to the individual and group practices, kind of what I've come up with throughout the years. Research on on efficacy and individual group experiential practice. When it comes to the research piece, like I said, I'll provide some ideas of where that came from, but the bibliography will be most helpful in figuring that out. And then we'll talk about how we apply it at Aspen Ridge. In theory and in practice, there are some pieces that, like I said, are very misunderstood. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. Then we'll go into questions and comments. I'm hoping to leave a lot of space for that because part of my design here is to provide a template that works to help provide experiential therapy. And I think that the discussion will be very good to have in that respect. So that is how we will move forward. And let me do one thing here. Okay, yeah, I'm going to have to check the Q&A just about every slide if you have any questions. So here we go with the ideas. I think in order to understand what my interests are in experiential therapy, you have to understand a little bit about me. So here you see the me that most of you, if you know me, see every day. And now you will see the me that is really me. Um, this is my life outdoors and my life as far as what I experience, moving out here and so on and so forth. So, a couple of things to understand as far as experiential journey goes. My whole family is from a small town in northeastern Utah called Vernal. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that. Most people don't know it unless they've been there. And we've lived there for generations. And as far as my background here, this is the outdoors areas in Vernal. So, I grew up in the Midwest, but my whole family is from Utah. So we would go back and visit every year. And, really my heart is here in the mountains. This area right here is actually named after a family member of mine called Hacking Lake, up outside of Vernal, about 30 minutes. So this is where I cut my teeth with the outdoors and the mountains. My grandfather was actually what at the time was a hospital administrator. He was in the hospital administrator for the 40s and 50s and 60s, and that is actually now what they call a social worker. He did admissions and discharges and discharge planning. Helped people get comfortable after they were done with their surgeries, and that was his job. He was also a really good fly fisherman, probably the best that I've ever met in my entire life. So when I was growing up, that's what life was about. I would be in the Midwest, but we would look forward to these trips out here pretty much every year. And what we do is spend a little time in his house and then head straight up to these areas here. This is what I consider home now. And super important to understand this. My whole life really kind of falls around the outdoors, going through into the mountains. This is where I find the absolute most peace in my life, is going through that whole process. So that is part of who I am. And I have to confess that part of the reason I got involved in experiential therapy was so I could figure out how to play at work. So that's a little guilty pleasure of mine. When it comes to what we experience in the mountains, it's very applicable to what we experience in experiential therapy, which I'll get to in a minute here. But that's really where the motivation came from. The peace and healing that we experience when we go to mountain areas and when we go to outdoor spaces is something that we want to recreate in the therapeutic process, particularly in addictions. Providing people a place where they can be themselves and be, in a space where they feel comfortable and relaxed. These are all parts of what we experience in experiential therapy, and that's what I seek in my own personal life. To be quite honest, I'm up there pretty much once or twice a week, all year long. It doesn't matter whether it's winter or whether it's in the middle of the summer. that's where I'd rather be. So now I guiltily take my clients up there too. So these are just some areas that I've visited and been a part of, and something that I really enjoy. So that was where I kind of came from with the background of this whole thing, and that's really been my experience in the ideas. But then, as I've grown and decided to go into the field of social work, my first job in social work was all the way back in 1999, doing basically behavioral health tech stuff at a detention center for kids. So as I was watching these things happen and working in my personal life to have these things, I often wondered why we didn't give that enough to other, other populations and people that we were trying to help. So part, professional, part personal, a little selfish to be like, hey, I love these things. I want to provide them to other people. Lo and behold, there's actually a whole theory of development and experiential therapy that actually says the exact same thing. We'll talk about the dynamics of that here in a minute, but this is what my inspiration was. So um, let's see. Here's where I started to kind of look at the idea of experiential, and this was probably about, I don't know, 16, 17 years ago that I started to have these experiences. The very first experience I had out of undergraduate school was working as a victim advocate. Interesting part about that is that we were out of the office all the time, on site, on scene after there had been some sort of incident or accident or a victim of a crime. Those were things that we saw all the time. I remember this one particular client of mine. It was probably the very first call that I had in victim advocacy. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And there was a victim of a domestic violence dispute that I was working with, and I actually went into her home and was working with her in that area. And as I was going through that whole process of helping her, she was opening up so much while we were sitting in her home and feeling comfortable in her own environment. There was so many different things that go into that too. I mean, the safety process and so on and so forth. While I was having that experience and helping her through the process of being safe, and you got to take into account she had just experienced something pretty traumatic, but at the same time, noticing how much that opening up was going on was one of the things that really struck out to me. So the next day, we're going through all of the different safety things and going over the types of things you need to do to be safe. And one of those things was, come into the office the next day so that we can talk a little bit more about it. And granted, we were both exhausted by the time she showed up. It's about 4 o'clock the next day. But when she came into the office, all of the different things that we had talked about and all, life story and the whole, how their dynamics of their relationship worked and all these different things I learned about her, the next day in the office, she had just shut down and I couldn't get much out of her. And I was just really struck by the environment and how much that had an effect on somebody. So that's really where I started to kind of grow into understanding that setting matters when we're working with people. Traditional office therapy, that's the way that we do it, and that's something that we foster, and there's a lot of effectiveness to it. But there's also something to be said for having somebody in an environment in which they feel more comfortable. So I started to get little clues on how this actually works to help people through problems, and that experiential therapy actually provides. So that was the first experience. The second one that really struck out to me was I was working in a youth transition area of work about 2010, 2011, about 10 years ago. And the whole philosophy of that was that we were more coaches than therapists. And in that process, we would, take them to go actually apply for jobs and take them to go apply for school. And those were the kinds of things that we would work with them on. And as we were going through that process, I noticed how much they would open up in their in a car, for instance. We actually called it car therapy at that point. Four-wheel therapy. There were a few other ways to do it, but there was so much more opening up when we were actually doing something versus sitting in an office talking about it. And kids, especially who've been through foster care and DYC and experienced a lot of trauma as a kid, have the hardest time opening up to people because the trust factor is there. Most of the time when they go into an office, it means that they're in trouble or something's going to change. So therefore, that's another piece of the setting that really just kind of struck me. So I started to develop an idea about experiential therapy and about how to work. And I started to do more research about how experiential therapy is effective and what are the different elements of it, because there was so much more alliance and connection and opening up when you're in a different setting, especially in a car or doing an activity. And then I started to put the theory into practice, getting into the research and understanding how this works. That's where I really went. And that's where I started to formulate these things when it comes to my graduate school experience and how I was able to begin to use experiential therapy in a different light. So I'm going to just go over this with you as briefly as possible. Again, I'm not really wanting to spend too much time on the research and the development. I think it's pretty well known that this is a good best practice to use in addictions. So we'll talk about that first. So when I first started to look into this and say, okay, what is experiential therapy and how does that pair with who I am as a person and as a practitioner, and how do I want to bring this forward? So this is really what experiential boils down to. Experiential therapy is a therapeutic technique that uses expressive tools and activities such as role playing or acting, props, arts and crafts, music, animal care, guided imagery, or various forms of recreation to reenact or re-experience emotional situations. So essentially, what we have seen from experiential up to this point is really looking at reenacting or re-experiencing emotional situations. That's one of the bases that we understand about experiential therapy. And most people, when they think about experiential therapy and the types of it, are looking at those kinds of reenactments or recreations. But what I started to look at was more the elements of what makes these things effective. And that's this next part here. The client focuses on the activities, and the focus is the important part. Through the experience, begins to identify emotions associated with success, disappointment, responsibility, and self-esteem. Under the guidance of trained experiential therapists, the client can begin to release and explore negative feelings of anger, hurt, shame, as they relate to past experiences that may have been blocked or still linger. That's what it was all about. I had a hard time making that leap when I was working through this process and deciding what I wanted to do. A lot of this stuff is very formulaic. There is a process to it, particularly as I'll go through the examples of experiential therapy throughout the years in the history. You'll see that these things do have structure to them. And that's where I was kind of lost, because it's like, well, if I want to take people outdoors to do things and do the therapy, and actually that's the name the name of this presentation came from one of the kids, where I took him out to the mountains, and the very next time I saw him, instead of wanting to sit in the office, he's like, can we just, head to the mountains again? Can we go to the woods to do therapy? And that's where I kind of came up with that idea. But making that leap from a structured process that is offered in experiential therapy to, something a little bit more traditional kind of office therapy, but using it outdoors, there was a gap there. And I'll explain here in a minute, because here's what we see. So with experiential therapy, the traditional ideas of it, and this has been around since, even as early as the 40s and 50s, the experiential theory really or originated with the person-centered experience. We see a lot of Gestalt therapy and a lot of Rogerian techniques. And those of you who are practitioners know that does fall on role play and being able to provide some different perspectives on people from there. So they were psychodynamic theory and practice at first, and they really did tie into what people's past experiences were and be able to bring those things out. Those are the basic developmental ideas behind experiential, as well as focusing on, and this one was really important, focusing on empathetic attunement and a communicated understanding. These were the bases of where these types of therapies started to emerge. We also see the beginnings of a different look at it through one of the practitioners named Carl Whitaker. He was a developer of experiential family therapy, symbolic interaction, role plays. This is where the idea of experiential came from, of reenacting or doing a role play as another family member, for instance. But what his theory really focused on, and what I began to key in on, and actually what we use here at AspenRidge now, are the elements of the theory. What makes experiential work? So when you're doing a role play or a symbolic interaction, what are the types of things that people experience? And again, the research suggests that these are very effective techniques to use in therapy in general. So I, in graduate school, took these elements of this theory and began to apply it in a slightly different way to recreational activity and to different types of experiences, such as just driving around and talking. Um, what we see here are the elements. Distraction. There's some truth to this when it comes down to it. If you think about it like this, when you're sitting in an office, the whole idea is watching body language and watching how people's eye contact go. We all use kind of mini mental status exams and observe what people's behavior is in this office setting. What can happen a lot of times is that it's not very natural if somebody's focusing on the environment and focusing on just the interaction between you and the client. Having a distraction is actually very helpful to create comfortability and the ability for someone to kind of get that out of their heads, that like, what am I supposed to say, how am I supposed to say it? So the distraction actually creates focus on other things, and distracts the senses from being on high alert, so to speak. We also see awareness of the emotional state. What that basically means is that people become more grounded in what's happening in the moment when they're doing experiential things. And I found that that was the case with a lot of different types of recreation. So their emotional awareness is hugely, hugely important. The other piece is that, we say vulnerability and courage, but really when we're using experiential therapy to help people in either these traditional ways or, what we came up with through my own research was vulnerability and courage, the ability to try new things and the ability to really just let your guard down. That's what the element leads to as far as that goes. Um, Also, with experiential types of therapy, fostering creativity, being able to use imagination and use creative problem solving. And what that really leads to for people is an increase in resilience. And I will share a little bit about my research in resiliency in particular when it comes to how that affected those foster kids I was working with when I first started doing this technique and how we actually use it here at Aspen Ridge as well. So that's part of the theory. So these elements we're going to be talking about quite a bit. So keep those elements in mind. Now, what we see now, so from about the 70s on, we start to see a lot more experiential therapy being used, particularly in addiction treatment, and it has diversified immensely. Just using the elements that we were speaking about before, which are extremely important, especially when it comes to the distraction, the change of focus, in a lot of ways, lack of eye contact, letting your guard down, vulnerability, all of those things come into play in each one of these areas. But in across the board at this point, we see them in a lot of different ways. By the way, when it comes to people in the photographs, this is my son and my father. So to be honest, I didn't ask them for permission. I figured they'd just be okay with it. So that's a that's just an idea of the connection between animal and person. So what we see is experiential expanding. What most people think about when they think experiential are, the play therapies, the sand trays, which are a very effective tool when it comes to working with youth. And again, those elements are the thing that matters the most. But we also see this in cooking, recreation, which I'll get back to in a minute because I really keyed in on that. Um, we also see it in elements of art therapy. It's a effective construct, and art therapy is its own entity when it comes down to it. But there are ideas of experiential when it comes to those techniques I was talking about before. We also see it a lot in equine therapy. That seems to be a very popular type of experiential therapy when it comes to addictions, especially. That's about relating to the animal and, being able to have the experience of using that animal to reenact those emotional situations that you had during trauma. Very effective types of therapy. We also see it in mindfulness and guided imagery, which was one of those things that I did in my presentations in graduate school, which I'll get to in a moment. But that's where it's gone. So it started off as more of a theoretical approach to how we present practice to all of these different areas that we see today. And as I go through the process, we'll see when I was in graduate school doing this, what I did was started to translate the elements of experiential therapy to multiple modalities. What that basically means is that we extracted, during my process, the types of things that were going on in experiential and applied them to different theories that work. So what I did in graduate school was I took these kids I was working with through foster care, youth programs, and the DYC, Department of Youth Corrections. And we did a single subject design process and direct practice evaluation that actually took those elements alone and took them out of the office and worked with these kids in different areas. We did use what I used, and still today is more of my expertise and area of concern, was that I would use cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, a lot of solution focused types of therapies, empowerment modeling, and use that as the direct therapeutic practice. So what I did was I took all of those elements from the experiential piece and applied them to all of these different techniques instead of just using one structured modality from experiential. This was something that was empirically researched. So we did use a lot of different instruments and measurement tools. Among those instruments were the CD risk test, which actually measures resiliency within an individual client. We also use the Beck's depression scale, the mini version of that scale. And I would apply those tests at each individual area of work. So we started off with all of these different kids in office settings, and we would measure what they were doing when it came to resiliency and reducing depression and anxiety. And we would measure those things. And after a period of 6 weeks of working in office therapy only, I would take them outside and do something experiential. Most of those kids, as you can probably guess, were kids that I just took fly fishing. But then there was also another kid that I would really do task centered stuff with. Like we would go and apply for jobs and apply for schools, but we were still using those experiential techniques and using the solution focused or the CBT in order to match, what they were doing. And then we would retest them in the next 6 week period to find out what the results were. So, in this respect, what we have learned about this and what my paper really focused on were the resiliency pieces and the depression. What I saw in the paper itself and what I reported across was a dramatic increase in particularly resiliency. What we would see with these kids is the connection in the relationship would be stronger. We would see a lot more emotional attunement when it came to how a client was relating to me as an individual practitioner. And the resiliency scale and the CD risk were increasing dramatically after that first 6 week period. We would see these kids increase in resiliency up to upwards of 120%, which when I was in graduate school, I didn't think was possible, but they really did increase their scores by over double what they were when they started. So we would take the baseline, we would do the original pieces of it, and then we would add in that the new techniques. And as we added those new techniques in with experiential therapy, we would see a dramatic increase. This was the justification for practice, and why in my particular area I have really focused on making sure that we do things that are not just traditional office settings, which we have a great deal of leeway with here at AspenRidge, and we do provide the ability for taking walks, going to do activities, and not just sitting around in an office setting. And so it's more than just a personal philosophy for me. This really is something that does have a scientific basis behind it. So that's really what we've heard. When it comes to the stories and the types of things that we've heard from clients about problem solving, what we see here for experiential is that it helps people feel more comfortable, and it helps reduce the anxiety of being in a program like this, but it also provides good ideas for solution focus. I hear from clients all the time that their greatest aha moments have been while they've been doing the experiential therapy. So this is where we have. And again, as a reminder, up here, I'm going to just remind everyone that this all does have to do with how we're distracting the senses, providing that vulnerability, helping people understand that they can do things and they have the power to do them and find that resiliency. And then the emotional attunement is super, super important while we're providing the experiential therapy. So we've taken this, and this is how we actually practice it. So this is what we do at AspenRidge, and I wanted to illustrate this. This particular picture is where we actually do the fly fishing lessons, and we don't do that at Experiential every week, but we do have a section of experiential therapy over a 2-week period where we provide everybody the opportunity to learn. And while we do it, we have these different focuses that we provide. So truth is that we play a lot. And we play, and the clients don't even realize they're getting therapy. They're just going out there to have fun, and that's one of my favorite parts about it, is that they really have a sense of understanding of that it's a fun thing, but they also learn while they're going through the process. We also provide a variety of activities. This is not just fly fishing lessons. We do all sorts of things, which I'll illustrate in just a minute here, but wanted to show and focus on this piece first. Here are some of the important elements, and this is probably the basis and structure of the whole program. I'm actually looking at a question, so I'll answer that question in just a minute. Let me finish this slide. Here at AspenRidge, our focus is working with people through addictions. And the important elements of adapting what I did in graduate school to this is having an intentional approach. What I really suggest while you're going through this practice is to have that intention of understanding what clients are going through. This means that we need to have our therapists who are doing this kind of practice really prepared, focused on certain conversations with group processing and individual work. What this really matters here is that you understand what every client is going through while you're doing the experiential piece. So what I typically do there is that I will isolate certain folks that are dealing with, family conflicts, or, a particular problem with relapse prevention, and I work with that person while we're doing the activity on the individual basis. Then we process it as a group afterwards. So preparation is key, making sure you understand what's going on with your clients and making sure you understand what's happening. And literally, you can do an activity and help them through the therapeutic process very easily if you understand and know where they're coming from. So know what the audience is. That's really what that basically boils down to. But then we actually use experiential techniques, and that's the other piece that's important. Understanding that resiliency is important. Understanding the vulnerability that it takes, the solution focused type of therapies, and then really just apply what you're best at as a practitioner. Whether that's psychodynamic or CBT or DBT, mindfulness, grounding skills. What is your bag is what you bring to the table, and what we really suggest that you work with. So know what techniques you're using in experiential, and also know your individual practice. So that's that piece. What we actually use experiential for has further applications, and extremely important ones in experiential. This is why most programs around the country have an experiential component. What the research says is that you find that people will foster a better sense of self-care. Basically, what that means is introducing them to a new hobby they may have never thought of before. We also foster fellowship. In these groups, we see people go off in pods and be able to communicate with each other in ways that they normally wouldn't. Also, solution focused, just getting out of the office and getting away from everything gives the opportunity to say, okay, how can I solve this problem in a creative way? But also, mindfulness, the spirituality piece, particularly connecting with nature, which is where I started with my journey in the first place. So it's very important for me. But it also teaches distress tolerance and ways of dealing with your emotions through activity. So that's how it's grown here at AspenRidge, and how we actually foster that idea. And the other piece is using vulnerability, emotional attunement, and connectivity. Always keep those things in person, and be intentional about how you're approaching those things through the practice. That's how it's grown while we have been here. Let me take a minute just to answer a couple of questions. Yeah, so actually that's interesting. Have you found issues legitimizing experiential therapy with insurance companies? That's a question that somebody has asked from the audience. I would say it does become a difficult process unless we, show the the practice purpose. And really what I found with insurance companies is that if I explain to them how the practice works and use the examples of the types of therapy for, play therapy, sand tray therapy, and so on and so forth, that does become a justification that works. So that's typically how we've handled that one is, there is a really good research base behind it. So make sure that. We have another question. Would you choose the experiential activities for the patients or let them suggest a few activities as well? That's actually a very good question. That came from a person named Carolina. Thank you, Carolina. In our process here, we have some leeway on that. I really think that as long as you keep the intention of experiential, with the distraction, vulnerability, resiliency, the pieces that we've discussed, I really find that if you keep those in mind, allowing for a little choice is okay, as long as you have that kind of targeted, intentional process. So yeah, I do let them pick what they like to do. And actually, it's funny you say that because in this environment right now in COVID, our ability to do experiential is pretty limited. And now we've got weather coming in too. So in that respect, there aren't many choices, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And we do have to be intentional, but when we have the opportunity, allowing some people to choose that activity is important. And it's something that can be very helpful as long as you kind of keep in mind what the whole intention and process is of working through those different techniques. So thank you for the questions. That was very helpful. So this is how we use it here. And let me see. Oh, no other questions. This is how we use it here. And when it comes to our own practices, I kind of wanted to illustrate for you a little bit about how we use this process. So here are some of the activities that we use, that we do on a regular basis. So I wanted to describe to you a little bit about how they're useful in providing the techniques that we do. Obviously, we've got fly fishing. By the way, these are all stock images, no copyrights on any of these images, just using to illustrate how it works. So we do the fly fishing piece quite a bit, and something that we try to contact or connect with on a regular basis. A lot of that really does teach some focus, and really when you're teaching people how to fly fish, probably the best thing it teaches is frustration tolerance. It's not an easy thing to pick up in a day or two. So we do see a lot of people working through that piece. The other thing that's important here for the fly fishing lessons, that was one of my favorites, is that we do a processing session before we even begin about the connection between, and this is a mindfulness processing activity, the connection between mountain streams and canyons and the addiction and recovery process. Essentially saying that working through addiction and recovery, we have parts of our brains that are carved out like canyons that go straight from certain emotions to substance use. And these canyons have formed over millions of years, but there are ways to divert it, and there are ways to work within that environment to create success. And that's how we kind of work through the process of teaching the fly fishing lessons. It's not so much about the teaching as it is the processing that we do around it. But we've also done mindfulness activities such as pottery painting, which provides that focus. I've got to tell you, some of the most important things that I have ever learned from somebody is when their hands are distracted by painting something, and they are just willing to have the most amazing conversations. That's probably one of my favorites to go to, where the pottery painting piece, favorites to go to just sit and listen to the clients kind of talk to each other. And how they kind of communicate when they have complete distraction of their hands. The other cool part is that we're able to decorate our office with some of the pottery that have. We have a cat here that was a pottery painting. We call it our suggestion cat, and that thing is part of the process of the creation. So that's it. So we've also gone to museums and explored different types of history. This also opens up a lot of different avenues when it comes to conversations that you can use traditional CBT techniques for, DBT techniques. You can apply it to just basically any modality, as long as you're using those elements that matter for experiential therapy. We do even do things like bowling, and actually one of the most impactful conversations that I've ever had with a client about being in treatment happened over bowling. This one particular person, it's a very recent person, was actually feeling very stressed about being in treatment and felt like they were going to be in jail and it was going to be a horrible experience. But during the process of just having a bowl with them, we were able to kind of talk through that whole thing and help them feel a lot more comfortable about being in treatment and reducing that anxiety. And again, that was something that was a targeted and intentional thing. I had been informed that person was having struggles beforehand, really picked them out during that process and said, hey, what are you experiencing? How's this going? And it was very fortunate this person just happens to love the bowl too. And they beat me really good. So that was another piece that was really important. But we've also done a great deal of hiking. Great deal of hiking. And then we also have um, archery. And right now, because we're in COVID, about the only thing that we can do is the outdoor stuff. So we've been doing a great deal of disc golf. And what we do there is we put people in pods of, 4 or 5 golfers. And then I usually pop between those things and hit those intentional conversations that are so crucial to this whole process while we're doing that. But what I see a whole lot with that is a bunch of fellowship. Again, it's not an easy sport. It's a lot harder than people think. So being able to apply those frustration techniques and distress tolerance, conflict resolution, I've seen people in these activities solve problems within the milieu simply by doing an activity together. So that's another piece where you could actually use that intentional action, put people in certain groups together who are having challenges with each other. So that's something that we've engaged in as well. And archery too, that's something we haven't been able to do very much lately, but that does teach a lot of ability, resilience, all of those different elements that we've been discussing throughout this whole program. So those are the types of things that we do here. And there's a variety of things, again, if somebody has something that they really want to do, we typically try to hit those things a little bit. Their connection to that particular activity is also very helpful in letting their guards down, providing that vulnerability. So, be watching for those things if you're going to create a program like this. Make sure that you are having that inclusion. I think that's important. Let me check and see if I have any other questions. Um, who leads the activities? Do you hire guides and use companies or lead yourselves? Well, for the fly fishing piece, I'm actually a certified fly fishing guide. So I do the teaching for that one. And as far as leading activities go, if we're just doing something fun, then obviously everyone is kind of the leader. I will guide discussions. We will guide to those techniques of therapeutic practice that matter. But when it comes to risk management as well, it's very important that you sign a liability waiver. That's actually a really important and legitimate question. Risk management is a big piece to it. There are, injuries that can occur, and we have to be very careful about that. Having a liability waiver as a company is extremely important. And if you are out of state from Colorado, make sure you're following your state laws on what those liability waivers look like. But I have a liability waiver for anytime I do this in private practice, and there is one that we have available through our intake paperwork as well. So thank you for that question. So again, these are the kinds of things that we do, and how we actually operate with this, keeping in mind those the importance of it, the techniques, and the types of techniques you bring to a table as a practitioner. Here's kind of the client responses. So since I've done this about 8 years ago was, when I finished my master's thesis on this particular project or professional paper, excuse me. So as I was walking through this process, I was doing the research, I found out how effective it was, but honestly, I've just been doing it mostly as a practice. So I wanted to offer to you today to close out the program before we go to the question and answer period is some of the things I've seen from clients about how it's important and how it works. So here are the key takeaways that I've learned through actually the experience of it as opposed to the research that I can see being helpful and how this works. And remember, all of these different pieces that I'm talking about here have come from intentional conversations and knowing what your clients are going through. That client-centered approach is extremely important if you're going to use this as an actual therapeutic technique. But what I've seen it be helpful with is providing easing into the program, such as our bowler friend from the prior examples. Providing insight on how to actually manage part of a program or part of the addiction process, saying, the lights come on all the time when we're doing this kind of process, and say, hey, this is something that I really need to do. Frustration tolerance, again, learning an activity that you don't know very well teaches how you can manage frustration tolerance without using substances. Resolving conflict. I have seen so many conflicts resolved between different members of the cohort and the milieu simply by doing something together. Again, we've touched on resilience a lot, super important. I find that self-care is a big deal. We did have a fellow over the summer who we took on fishing excursions. Again, that was something very prevalent during the first quarantine in COVID, and the self-care process. We went fishing all the time, and last time I checked, this guy was still fishing about once or twice a week in order to have self-care for himself through recovery. And again, the mindfulness, the contentment, the gratitude. I've taken people on these activities in mountains or just going to parks, and I've seen people just journal forever and writing things out and being able to have gratitude for the world around them and the peace that it brings. And so that's a big piece. Emotional regulation, being able to be vulnerable, just feeling enough to be yourself that you can, again, that letting that guard down thing. Fostering fellowship, talking about different things in relapse prevention and in the program, giving people a venue to do that. Also, trauma recovery. That's a really big piece to this, teaching people about how to integrate trauma into their spectrums and into their lives, something that's very vital focus for what we do. And even grief and loss processing, or connecting to a family member. Having a client before who, fly fishing was part of their family, just very similar to mine, and being able to reconnect to people that they have lost in their lives through this activity and bringing that back into their lives. Those are some of the qualitative outcomes that we've seen while we've been working through this process. And actually, as I have an experiment. So we're going to do an experiment together, because I actually asked our current clients to give me a quick quote on what really works for them in experiential and what they've gotten out of it. So I'm going to take a chance here, and I'm going to read some of the quotes. And you got to remember, some of these people some of these folks are real jokesters, so we're going to see how this works. But I have got a list of what they like about experiential, and I promised them that I would not read it until we were done with this whole thing. So we're going to find out what they have to say. These are some of the effects that we see. So I get to learn new things with a peer group that is completely non-judgmental. So again, that's about that fostering of fellowship. I love experiential because I get to have fun without alcohol and get to know other people in the group. So these are actually great. I was expecting somebody to put something on here that wasn't appropriate. I haven't found one yet. Let's see. Experiential has definitely been a great stress reliever. So again, with that distress tolerance, it's nice breaking up the week by going out and doing enjoyable things. It's nice going out and doing things with the group that don't always involve the topics about addiction. So again, that's that piece of distraction. Let me see what else they have to say. This is actually good stuff. Folks, I was actually expecting somebody to put a joke in here. I guarantee it's coming. Other things clients have said: experiential therapy is the most useful group for me. It makes me feel like I am a part of society, which as an addict, I have been disconnected with for so long. It helps break the classroom. Oh, this is the funny one. It helps break the classroom blah, blah, blahs. Something very positive to look forward to. It relieves stress and allows me to experience breathing and being with nature. That's that mindfulness piece. Lets me bond with other people in the group and helps relieve stress and frustration. Yeah, these are great ideas. Other things our clients get from it: it helps break up the monotony of the week. Amen to that. Relieves stress and teaches you that you can learn how to have fun being sober. So that's just what we get out of it. And this is real time, folks. This is something I just asked them to do about an hour ago. So you can see the effects and the understanding and the practice of it is important. But that all comes from that intentional approach of it. It's not just having fun, although it might look like it. It's not just having fun. It really is working through a process to gain skills in order to access recovery. that's the way that our process works with it, and that is the way that we operate that, and that is my philosophy as a practitioner as well. So that's where we came up with the idea. I would like to thank everybody for listening to me ramble on. I'm so much used to doing these things in person, and I look forward to doing this again in person as this situation plays out with the whole COVID and pandemic. But at the same time, I did want to leave a good, about 5 to 7 minutes for questions. So thanks again, everybody, for attending. I super, super appreciate it. And we're going to look at any more questions. So now would be a time if you have any more questions or anything to add to the presentation, please do so now. Start typing and I'll be looking for those things. So if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to answer them right now. And again, thank you so much for attending. And let me see what else we have. Let's see. Anything else? Oh, there's the chat. Okay, let's see. I'm having a hard time seeing these things in real time.
I can read it to you, Keith. So we have,
yeah. Can you read any other questions that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had not a question, but a comment from Kathleen, and she's saying that it is very normalizing and it reflects real life.
Yeah, it really does. It actually gives them an opportunity to use skills outside of our office and away from the setting where they kind of feel pressured sometimes to be the model client, or the pressure that they have to actually like be really just focused on their problems and work on those things. So that's very true. Thank you for saying so.
We had another comment. Well, it was under the question chat box, and it was from Andy. And he said, I grew up in Craig, definitely familiar with Vernal. So you had someone that was familiar.
That's so funny, because only people from the western slope of Colorado know where my hometown is. So everybody that I've ever met from anywhere from Craig to Grand Junction, they're all like, oh yeah, we all know Vernal. That's about it. So other than that, welcome to the show. Nobody's ever heard of it before.
Yeah. Let's see. And we have another comment from Randall. Great presentation. Thank you, Keith. He'll like to meet you personally. So yeah. Schedule something to meet in person. And we have a lot of opportunity for experiential therapy here at the farm. Yeah. And would like to connect with you to explore our options.
Yeah, I've heard of this place, and Karen, definitely make sure that my contact information is available to everybody. Send me an email, shoot me a phone call. I'm more than happy to kind of go over these things a little bit more thoroughly with anybody who would like to explore it further.
Definitely. I think that's all we have for now.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you all so much for spending your lunch hour with me. Certainly hope that you guys have learned something, and really especially about how to apply techniques and the intentional process of experiential. So make sure that you always keep that in mind while you're going through your own programs. And again, thanks everybody for attending, and I hope that everybody has a fantastic day. I would also suggest that you get outside because it's beautiful.
It is beautiful. Thank you guys so much, and I will be sending you all the recorded webinar. So check your inbox. Should be coming soon.
Awesome. All right. Thanks again, folks.